Yeah, okay, so I've been writing and teaching about this for decades, but of course what Chris didn't tell you is that I began when I was 12.
You are allowed to drink.
Yeah. Okay, so I promised Chris that I would hang in with the allotted time this morning. I have kind of a long story I want to share with you, and of course I'm not a morning person. I suspect a lot of people around this table are morning people. I'm not a morning person, so if I start to slow down, I need you to listen more quickly, and in that way, hopefully 40 minutes from now, I'll be more or less through the highlights of this story. Okay, so we heard an awful lot of stuff yesterday, and of course it's an easy task, thank you, Chris, to integrate and synthesize so many brilliant comments from so many different points of view, different levels of analysis, different regions of the world. I want to start my story from a different perspective, I think, than the one we've been talking about. And I think of it this way, you know, we're all sitting around the table here, kind of business garb, and talking about the economy, talking about capitalism. At the end of the day, we go home. We go home to our families, our neighborhoods, our communities. That's the place that holds us, and it shapes us. Although when we're here, we don't talk that much about how it shapes us. That part isn't disclosed. It's kind of hidden. It's in the background. Well, the economy and capitalism are exactly the same way. When the economy goes home, it goes home to its society. And when society goes home, it goes home to history. And these things are nested like Russian dolls. And it's really difficult to understand what's happening in our economy, or for that matter, in our moment in capitalism, without kind of moving backward to the place where these big complex systems are being held. And they're being held in our society, in our moment in history. And so that's the level, that's the strata, that's the dimension that I want to try to first shed some light on and then connect up to the very urgent issues that we're talking about today as far as capitalism, wither, and so on. Okay, so to start out, let me just say that I think this, we're not here to talk about the crisis. And so the only thing I'm going to say about that is I think the crisis is toward the end of a chapter. I don't think it's the beginning of a chapter. I think it represents, in my reading of history, a part of a larger denouement. And it's a denouement of what has been the dominant model of capitalism in the 20th century. And that dominant model is primarily drawn from the American scene, from American business models and American business practices and models that were invented about a century ago to serve a very different kind of society with a very different set of needs. In the history of capitalism, the winding down of one cycle of accumulation is typically overlapped with the emergence of a new kind of cycle, the rise of a new kind of cycle. Now, historically, these cycles have been driven by scale and scope. So, you know, we went from the Italian city-states to the Dutch Union of Provinces to the British Empire and ultimately to the American continent. And in every one of these economic revolutions, as the preeminence of capitalism shifted to these new regions or nation-states, the complexity of the system grew so much, and so we needed a place, an entity with larger scale and scope to meet the challenges of that complexity. But the thing is, these cycles of capitalism have also been driven not just by scale and scope, but by content, by the changing nature of the content of capitalism. What do I mean by content? I mean the specific kinds of business models and practices that create wealth in any given era. And that's the substance. So I'm kind of shifting the focus a bit from scale and scope, which is a lot of what we've been talking about, to what I think of as scale and substance, the shifting content of capitalism. So we're not only talking about changing geography now, we're talking about how capitalism moves as it develops a new understanding of the unmet needs within the populations of each era, and how it finds the new practices and the new models that are going to realize untapped economic value in these needs of the populations of that era. So if you think about it from the point of view of content, not only has the preeminence shifted around the world over the last several centuries, but we've shifted from the mercantile capitalism of the Venetian merchants and the Genoese traders to the Dutch and their trading, to the proprietary capitalism of the early factory owners and workshop owners like Wedgwood in Britain in the late 18th century, and ultimately to the mass production, mass consumption-based managerial capitalism of the American continent, which has dominated the 20th century. So it would be natural now for me to segue into what I think the next cycle is all about. But I want to do this a little bit differently, because what I thought I would do is start with a few examples. And there's this quote from the Grateful Dead. Of course, just bringing up the idea of the Grateful Dead gives away my age. But, you know, it goes something like, you get shown the light in the strangest of places if you look at it just right. Something like that, from Scarlet Begonias. Anyway, so I want to look at some examples, some of which will be familiar to you, and some will be very different because it's stuff that I'm working on. I'm going to share a little bit with you. And then I want to try and reinterpret these examples from a Zuboffian point of view and see if that helps us begin to piece together, you know, whether it's an elephant or a zebra or all that stuff. So let's start with the iPod, because the iPod is something ultimately familiar. We all know about the iPod. All right, so it's 1999 to 2003, and you've got the music industry. What's happening? Between those years, in that 4-year period, sales of CDs fell by 25% because, you know, people were going over to the kind of stuff that Josh and Catherine, everybody were telling us about yesterday, right? They're shifting over to peer-and-peer. They're going to Napster and Kazaa. And by 2003, 5 billion tracks are trading on the peer-to-peer networks every month, okay? So what do the music industry executives do? They exercise their brilliant economic agency by responding to the situation with creative adaptation. How many agree with that statement? Okay. Instead of creative adaptation, the music industry executives decide, you know, the ship may be sinking, but hey, I've got my life vest. So let's go down with the ship. So what they do is they cook up a variety of what were to be doomed approaches to shut down peer-to-peer. They're going to shut it down. And when that didn't quite work, they actually decided to take legal action against their most ardent, passionate customers. How's that for an economically rational business strategy, right? So they're, you know, breaking down the doors of high school students to put them in jail. All right, well, here comes Apple. All right, let's not give Steve Jobs all the credit. You know, he's this really smart team of you know, folks like the ones we were listening to late yesterday afternoon. And what do they say? They say, hey, you know what? Music listeners are not actually criminals. They're not mass consumption criminals. What they really are folks like you and me. I want the music I want, thank you very much, Mr. Music Industry, not the CDs that you happen to have spent the last 3 years producing. I want it how I want it, when I want it, where I want it, the way I want it, and if you're not going to give it to me, I'm going to give it to myself. So what the Apple team does is they set themselves a new pole star. You know what a pole star is? You know, that's how we used to find our way across the ocean following the pole star, the North Star. So they set themselves a new pole star, and the pole star was the unmet needs of people who love music. What a strange idea. And in order to follow that pole star, they sent out a couple of lifeboats. The first lifeboat was iPod, but iPod wasn't really enough. They needed a bigger and better lifeboat, and that was called iTunes. And so the twin lifeboats of iPod and iTunes went rowing over to the big, concentrated asset infrastructure of the old hierarchical command and control, mass production, mass consumption music industry, and said, you know what, we are not going to spend the next 15 years trying to change you guys, because we've got better things to do than throw our bodies against that barbed wire. Instead, here's 99 cents. We're going to take some of your assets, and we're going to row them back. And we're going to row them back to where the music listeners are. And we're going to reconnect them with the music listeners. And that's exactly what they did. They took assets out of the concentrated structure. They brought those assets back into a new space. They took them out of what I call organization space, and they brought them back into a new space, an empty space, a commercially uncolonized space that I call individual space, I space. And that's the space that is essentially the subjective space of the person that we used to call a consumer. We don't call them a consumer anymore. You know why? I have an interesting historical riff about this in my book, but you know, producer-consumer is creation and destruction. And historically, in the development of this terminology, producers were men, consumers were, guess what, girls. And so, you know, men create and consumers suck it all up, exhaust the value in that. So I try not to use the word consumers anymore, consumers, customers, and users. I like to think of these people as individuals, because it's all of us. Is there anyone in modern society who's not a consumer? I mean, do you have another way of getting your food? So what they did was they took those assets, they realigned them with the individuals who love music. And that realignment is what I call an institutional bypass. An institutional bypass. And in that institutional bypass, they created a cash magnet. By realigning with people, by realigning with their unmet needs, they created a cash magnet. So by 2007, that's just like 4 years after iTunes got launched, their sales reached $100 million. And then I just picked this up, you know, a couple of months ago. iTunes is now the largest music retailer in America. So we're talking about, you know, if iTunes was launched in 2003, we're talking about 5 years. Think of the cash, right? And that cash, that wealth was created out of this process of institutional bypass, realignment with unmet needs. Now, this is what I call solving the premium puzzle. Solving the premium puzzle is one of the things that has driven capitalism for centuries. What is the premium puzzle? In every generation, what used to be a luxury becomes a necessity, right? Adam Smith wrote about this. He called it one of the major drivers of capitalism. His example was, today every single person wants to wear a linen shirt, even peasants. They don't want to be identified with the hemp and muslin shirts of their fathers, all right? And he talked about a necessity is anything that a person needs, that they feels that they need for social participation. Okay, so in every generation, what used to be a luxury becomes a necessity. Okay, but no one has enough money to afford it. So the way we break through is by solving that premium puzzle, by figuring out how to give people the new stuff they want at a price they can afford. Okay, now that brings us to the fact that this is exactly what Schumpeter meant. You know, Joseph Schumpeter is a really compelling theorist of capitalism, and his theories of capitalism were actually based on a very profound sociology. A lot of people talk about creative destruction. I know you're reading this. A lot of people talk about creative destruction. But, you know, creative destruction is easy. We don't have to do anything for creative destruction. History does that for us. The much bigger and more important part of Schumpeter's theory of capitalist development and model of economic revolution has to do with the creative response. That's what we do as human agents, the creative response. And while we've been hearing a lot over the past couple of decades about the new thing and the new thing, I don't know if you know, but Schumpeter was the one who actually wrote the phrase, the new thing, right? And he said that the creative response is when, he loved entrepreneurs, recombine new and existing resources in wholly new ways to better meet society's need. And this is what he felt was the watershed between epochs, between eras, between chapters of capitalism. So what we saw in iPod and iTunes, well, just about everything that's written about it, you know, lauds it as this great electronic invention, product, it, you know, revived Apple, and so on and so forth. To me, that's not really what's important about it. What's important about it is it gives us a window into what happens when we actually realign assets with the new needs of today's population. Okay, but at the end of the day, an iPod is just an iPod. I mean, if I say that in front of my kids, they kill me because they can't live and breathe without their iPods. But as much as I love music, let's face it, it's still just music. So what happens now if we can take the logic of those lifeboats and asset migration and realignment and institutional bypass and releasing cash and hidden economic value, and if we can apply that logic to the stuff that is absolutely essential for our daily life as individuals in modern society? I'm talking about healthcare, I'm talking about education, insurance, bankinter, financial services, transportation, travel, housing, right? In every single one of these industries, in just about every region of the world, people are hurting because they are not being served in the way that they need, in the way they are yearning for. So what happens if we can release the untapped economic value in those unserved needs by moving into these other areas? Let me give you another example. Let's talk about autos. Since you mentioned it this morning, Chris, the case of Detroit. Look, Detroit is still manufacturing according to the Alfred Sloan playbook. Now, I've got this great quote from Rick Wagner. I used it in one of my Business Week columns a couple weeks ago, writing about the bailout. No bailout. Rick Wagner was asked by a journalist, don't you think it might be a good idea to bring somebody in as an executive from a completely different industry to give us, maybe a fresh take on GM's problems? And Rick Wagner, I have the exact quote, but I won't bother looking for that. Rick Wagner basically said, and I'll give you part of it verbatim, he said, "Oh no, that would be impossible. They wouldn't have a prayer. The reason He said, the problems that we're tracking have tails that go back 80 and 90 years. Okay? So, I mean, that's the problem. That's the problem right there. They're still looking up in Alfred Sloan's autobiography, how do we solve the problem, the fact that in 2007 we had 1 million unsold cars in inventory. Okay, that's a problem. Now, I'm not the first one to notice this, because just about every car dealer in America and an auto deal, the huge online agglomeration of dealerships, basically everybody, and every single consumer study of the auto industry that's been published in the past 20 years has said the same thing. But GM and the big three are so big and so distant and so insulated and so inward focused that, they're like those music industry guys. They are going down with the ship. So here we have a new automobile driver. And who is this driver? Obviously, they don't want the cars that are already in the pipeline because they're sitting there in the lots on the dealers' lots. So what do they want? They want a personal transportation experience. Okay, 20 minutes. Well, that's going to be interesting. They want a personal transportation experience. For some people, a car is a living room. For some people, a car is a nanny. People want an SRV, a socially responsible vehicle. And by my reading, that fuel efficiency is only a little bit of that. We're talking about, what percentage of the parts are recyclable? How are they going to be recycled? Are there toxic paints? Are there any child labor inputs into this car? How transparent is the supply chain? So there are a whole range of things that people are interested in addition to wanting to configure in detail their own driving experience. And of course, the experience isn't just about driving a car. It starts when you decide you want to buy one, and it ends when that last bit of metal or plastic is recycled. That's the experience, right? So clearly, Detroit is not going to come up with the answer to this, and people are wondering where the answer is going to come from. Well, I noticed the other day people regarded this as bizarre when Solar World, which is a German maker of solar panels, says, you know what, we're going to buy Opel. We want to buy Opel. And this was considered not only in the auto industry, but in the press as a bizarre turn. This is an example of just like music was rescued by some folks in computers and consumer electronics, the auto industry, those lifeboats to the auto industry that are going to grab those assets and migrate them and realign them with new people and their new needs, those lifeboats aren't going to come from Detroit. They're going to come from someplace where you would never have imagined looking. They're going to come from renegades, from outsiders, from the least expected, from the weirdos, from the misfits, right? That's where you want to look. And by the way, for the investors in the room, that's where you want to look. Look for the misfits. Look for the outsiders. Okay, so what we're facing now... Oh, okay. I'm going to show you this really quickly. I mentioned healthcare. I'm just going to show you this really quickly because we're doing very interesting work in elder care right now. And what this shows is that in the next 30 years, there's a really lot of older folks that are going to be alive in America. And in the county where I live, in the state of Maine, in northern New England, we have an exceptionally large, it's a very beautiful place in Maine, and so it became a magnet for a lot of retirees and so on. We have a lot of older folks, and this is a statement of a larger statement about healthcare hitting a brick wall. All right, when you look at these costs and you look at the number of people who can afford them, you are looking at a brick wall. You are looking at no way forward in the economic model of healthcare in general, elder care specifically. And of course, what is it that people want when they're growing old? You probably know. There are two things that are most associated with longevity. One is to have control over your own life, and the other is to be socially connected. Right? People want to stay in their own homes, in their own neighborhoods, in their own communities with as much steam power as they can. But of course, that's the most expensive option, and nobody can afford it. So it's a perfect example of the premium puzzle, and that's exactly where the whole healthcare story sits right now in all of America, most of the West, and many other parts of the world. What we're doing where I live is creating an entirely different economic model. Call it elder power. And this model takes assets out of the concentrated structure, reconfigures those assets around the individuals. We don't call them diseases. We don't even call them old people. The fact is that they are individuals, and their whole point is, the whole point of all this is to enable them to live their lives the way they want to live them. And what we've done is colonize space and resources that are empty and hidden. So when I talk about hidden physical and human resources, I'm talking about the fact that instead of putting people in nursing homes, in these concentrated structures, which are very, very costly, there is all sorts of hidden space that's no cost. And that's the hidden space in the homes of other older folks, right? And a lot of older folks are, perfectly capable of living life at home, and they've got all their faculties, but they're lonely, and they have extra bedrooms. And so those extra bedrooms become the space that we're colonizing. A lot of people in the community who have time on their hands, we call it slivers and rivers of time. Some have slivers of time, enough time to make a phone call once a week. Others have rivers of time, enough time to actually have someone in their home for a month who's recuperating from an operation. What we are doing is we are colonizing hidden resources that are physical and social. We're leveraging social networks. We are utilizing existing skills, both voluntary and paid, in the community. We are offering remote and direct medical support in a variety of ways on a virtual platform, on a 24/7 local cable TV station that we call Dr. TV. We've got mobile medical service. We've outfitted a range of ambulances as mobile medical care. They're actually being run by cooking grease from all the restaurants in Mid-Coast, Maine, and they are being supported by subscriptions from healthy families who would also like doctors to pay home visits. And so healthy families who have the cash flow paying subscriptions, and that's helping to support mobile medical service for people in this network who actually can't afford it. Anyway, I just wanted to give you a little sense of the numbers. This is very much a work in progress, but this gives you a little bit of a sense of what I mean by breaking through the premium puzzle. We're talking about a difference in such an order of magnitude when we look at capital expenditure and we look at operating costs. Right? We can, for $2,000 capitalized over the number of homes that we think we can have in this network, we can substitute that $2,000 for the $1 million that it now costs for one hospital bed, right? The $100,000 to $200,000 that it costs for a bed in a nursing home or an assisted living facility. We can, we are facing a situation now in our residential nursing homes where the state can only afford to pay $3 an hour for care. And that means for the building, for the staff, for the medical care, for the food, for every aspect of the care of the people who are in one of these local residential nursing homes. $3 an hour. You can't take care of a dog practically for $3 an hour, right? So this is a brick wall, and we believe that this is the kind of logic that is going to allow us to break through that brick wall. So what I want to talk about for the remaining 10 or 15 minutes is, what are you looking at here? Other than the fact that you're looking at my old hometown, Purmamarca, Argentina. I brought this picture because it's a picture of a chasm. This is a chasm. The chasm is the place where we live today. We are living at a moment in history, in economic history, where people have changed more than the institutions we depend upon. And since we're talking about business, let's be specific about business organizations. People have changed more than the business organizations that they must depend upon for consumption and for employment. 100 years ago, there was an emerging society of mass consumers, people who had basically no stuff, a little bit more discretionary income, and they wanted a lot more stuff. And breaking through the premium puzzle 100 years ago meant inventing new ways to get people stuff at a price they could afford. Thus was born mass production. Mass production was an economic logic that had never been discovered. And the one who finally put together the pieces of the premium puzzle, as you probably know, was Henry Ford. Now, a lot of the pieces were out there, just like Chris was saying, a lot of handprints on the elephant. A lot of the pieces were out there. But there was a day in 1913 in the life of the third incarnation of the Ford Motor Company when the engineers and the tinkerers and Ford himself looked up at each other at the end of the day, and I imagine they had kind of goosebumps because they knew at the end of the day that they had broken through to a completely virgin economic territory. And the economic logic in that territory was high throughput, low unit cost, and no one had been there before. Okay, so the deal for high throughput, low unit cost was Mr. Or Mrs. Customer, you are now an exogenous variable to the business process. You're on the outside of the business model. The only thing we owe you is efficiency, because efficiency is what's going to make it possible for us to standardize and give you a low-cost, fill in the blanks, automobile, refrigerator, dress, whatever consumer good you want to talk about. Now, that model was extremely successful. Concentrated assets, command and control, managerial hierarchy, standardization, interchangeability, consumer as an external variable. Very successful, created massive wealth, unprecedented wealth. Big economic story of the 20th century is wealth. That wealth had an unintended consequence. It created new kinds of people. People who are more educated, traveled, connected, informed, opinionated than any human beings to have ever walked the earth. These rooms, especially out there in the lobby, these rooms were created for an elite. People like us, at the time when these rooms were created, were a tiny percentage of the world population. And they lived in elite, buffeted, bubbled surroundings like these. But today, hundreds and hundreds of millions of people participate in this mentality that was once the precinct of the elite. And this is what I call the new society of individuals. The hallmark is a sense of psychological uniqueness. I am a unique individual. I am not simply my mother's daughter. I am not simply my father's son. My destiny is not born in my blood. I am the origin of my meanings. I am the origin of my destiny. I think of this with three headlines: sanctuary, voice, and commitment. Sanctuary, I want to have control over my life. I want to be the origin of my choices. Voice, I want to have influence, unmediated, and I want it to matter. Connection. Yes, I want to be connected to other people, but not with the conformity demands of the old feudal system, still characteristic of our large organizations. Now, very interesting stuff, the World Values Survey. The World Values Survey looks at exactly this, the rise of the new society of individuals, and it looks at it all over the world. Breaks it down into two axes. On one, self-expression, and on the other, the move away from traditional obedience to authority kinds of values. And the reason I want to show you this is because I want to show you that the world's, they define regions culturally: Confucian, Western ex-communism, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant Europe, the Hispanic world, Eastern communists, Africa, and South Asia. And you can see that all of these regions here, all of these cultural areas falling above the mean in their movement. All right? Now, but what's really interesting when you look at this is looking at the cohort effects. This is kind of a hard one to follow. So let me just point out a couple things. Like, can you hear me? This is a cohort born after 1980 in essentially Eastern Asia, what they call the Confucian countries, after 1980. And if you look at where they are on these new individualistic values, right, they're not that far away from the after 1980 cohort in the Anglo-Saxon world, right, versus where they were before 1921. So what you see here is tremendous movement, not just at the center of what we have thought of as the global economic system, but all around the global economic system. We're seeing hundreds of millions of people in all the world's regions. And now if you look at the 27 member states in the Eurobarometer, all but 2 of them have majority values defined by these new values of self-expression and individuality. So, what does this mean for capitalism? What does it mean for wealth creation? What it means is that one of the biggest, most unstoppable forces in modern history is consumption. And people on the left have issues about consumption, and people on the right have issues about consumption, but consumption is here to stay. That we can feel confident about. The thing is, though, consumption changes. The underlying structure, nature of consumption changes fundamentally over the centuries. And what I'm suggesting is that this new society of individuals has now fundamentally altered the structure of consumption, the dominant structure of consumption, to what I call an individuated consumption. And whereas the products and services, the low-cost products and services of the 20th century met the needs of the old mass consumer, they no longer meet the needs of the new individuated consumer. We need new kinds of entities operating on a new enterprise logic that are going to break through the premium puzzle and provide the new individual with the kind of individualized dignity, advocacy, and support that they are looking for to live their lives as they choose to live them. So what we're really talking about here is the fact that 100 years ago, we had a creative response. Remember the definition of creative response? The new thing, assets taken out of the old model, reorganized in a new way to do new things for new people and new needs. Creative destruction in the early 20th century led to a creative response, which was the rise of mass production to meet the needs of the new mass consumer. So the question becomes, what is the creative response for our times? I believe that we're looking at an entirely new definition of commerce, a commerce whose purpose is to enable individuals to live lives, to take their lives in their own hands and live their lives as they choose. Now, if I had said this to you 30 years ago or even 20 years ago, it would have been, okay, a very nice sociological insight. Thank you very much, Shoshana. Don't call us, we'll call you. But the world has changed. And what has changed? What has changed is that today we're living in the context of a technological infrastructure, of digital technology that gives us the means for infinite connection, infinite reach, and infinite individualizability. Now, in my view, having spent most of my adult life studying the emergence of these new technologies, in my view, the revolutionary potential of our digital infrastructure is still subjugated, by and large, to the old business model. Still, by and large, subjugated to the means and purposes of the 20th century business model. But if we can migrate that to a new context, a new social framework, a new productive framework, a new commercial framework, we have the means in which to cross this chasm, to realign essential assets with the new individual in the ways that they need, in the ways that they want. Right now, we are like people wandering in Plato's cave. The assets that we need are trapped. They're trapped in old physical and social frameworks that were invented essentially a century ago for different modes of production, distribution, consumption, for different people with different needs. But there are rays of light, and they break through. And when they break through, we rush to that source of illumination and warmth. And we fill it with our cash, as you saw in the case of iPod. We fill it with our passion, as you saw in the examples that especially Josh and Cell Bazaar. Cell Bazaar is a perfect example of an institutional bypass, right? That's what you're doing. You are bypassing the institutional, the old institutional structures for participation in a marketplace. You have given people a means to bypass those institutional structures and look at how they are filling. And though you may not have figured out all the ways that you need to do your metrics and all the new forms of financial evaluation that are going to be relevant, the fact that you've got 1.5 million users in the short time that you've been up and running, that's an iPod story, hon. That's an iPod story, right? That shows people rushing to colonize those little pieces of light that are going to provide the bypass, the realignment of assets that they have been waiting for in meeting those needs that are full of hidden economic value, right? And now your job is going to be to figure out how to really measure and evaluate that so you can do it even better. But you know, there are other examples. You know, look at people rushing into Facebook. Look at people rushing into the blogosphere, the internet in general. There are other examples of companies. A company called Tutor Vista out of Bangalore. They've got really smart people all over India, organized on a distributed platform, very low, almost no fixed cost. They offer all the tutoring you can eat for $99 a month to anybody in the world. Okay, and they are doing very, very well. There's an operation out of London called 10 UK. They offer lifestyle support, anything you need. They've got distributed platforms. They leverage it with professional, semi-professional expertise, networks, social networking. And in the midst of a really, really bad economic decline, they are having their best business months ever, their best numbers ever. Because of the kind of support they are offering to individuals based on advocacy and trust and alignment. And there are many other examples that are out there that offer us little pieces of the puzzle, whether it's open source, Wikipedia, medical tourism, the work of the Specialty Schools and Academies Trust in the UK, which has taken principles like this to drive it into the personalization of especially secondary education. There's groundbreaking stuff happening all over the place. We heard some more about it yesterday. So this is not a mistake, okay? This is opportunity. This is white space. This is uncolonized territory. This is individual space. Nobody's there yet, only little bits and pieces. What's there are people silently waiting. You know those Easter Island statues? You know, the statues that they built when they cut down the last tree? And the statues are facing out to sea, waiting for someone to come and rescue them. Right? Well, that's the new society of individuals. We are all waiting out there on the shores of atrocious healthcare, unsatisfactory education, atrocious insurance, travel experiences, all the key things that define our modern life. We are out there waiting. And of course, we're not just waiting. That's ultimately an unsatisfactory metaphor, because we're also doing things. And Josh, where are you? Josh was showing us yesterday, you know, instead of waiting, people are out there. They're not waiting for the legal profession to figure out that it should align with the interests of the client. They are out there figuring out how to be their own lawyers. They are out there, and where's Garrett? Your great example about the C Studio, is that what the C Studio, and they are out there using a digital platform, bypassing the old high-cost industry infrastructure. They're doing it themselves. So the fact is, for some of the big stuff like healthcare, yeah, we're waiting, but there's a lot of ways in which people are already out there doing it themselves. It's emergent behavior, because the institutional thing is just taking too long. And it's not economically rational because people are choosing to go down with their ships rather than get out of that concentrated behemoth and reconnect with us. So what we're looking at here, just to summarize, I kind of hate these things that summarize with lists, but what the heck. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of some of the differences between the old enterprise logic and the new enterprise logic for the new society of individuals, the shift from the old concentrated space to what I've called I space, the space of the individual, the idea that we are going from concentration to a distributed capitalism, distributing assets, configuring them around individuals and their communities, so that there is intimacy, there is dialogue. We're leveraging technology, we're leveraging social networks, and we're actually now creating what I think of as the social production of commerce, just as I think of our elder care work as the social production of healthcare. We're shifting from economies of scale to economies of trust. That's a whole other hour. We could talk about that. We're shifting from the consumer as an exogenous variable to a we, to advocacy, to, guess what? If I serve your needs, if I'm aligned with your interests, I get rich. If I violate your needs, I violate your interests, I don't get rich. That's what it's all about. I'm writing an article now. It's called, Can Capitalism Be Nice? The answer is no. Capitalism cannot be nice. What capitalism can be is aligned or unaligned. When capitalism is unaligned, it doesn't make as much money. When it doesn't make as much money, it goes into the final stages of its cycle, which are characterized by financialization. Financialization means that I can't make enough money selling my stuff, so instead I'm going to take really risky positions in all kinds of financial instruments, and I'm going to make more money on that than I am on selling you my stuff. And that's why return on sales and return on assets for the Fortune 500 have declined to near zero from mid-century, right? Because they can't make any money on their stuff. And the only way they've been making money, and interestingly enough, financialization characterizes the end of a cycle of accumulation in every single chapter of capitalism. And that's a little bit what I was thinking when I said to you before that this crisis isn't like the Big Bang. The crisis is like the final gasp, I think, of what has been a tortuous decline over several years, several decades. Okay, so obviously a shift in the infrastructure, that's a critical variable. Without that, we're not having this conversation. And I think the rest is, either self-explanatory or we need a whole day to talk about it. And so when we say what are the new entities, are we talking about a new nation state to which the new preeminent position is going to accrue? Are we talking about a new region? I don't think so. I think we're beyond that. And if you didn't get that feeling after you were listening to Josh and hearing about Cell Bazaar yesterday, I don't know what's, we're talking about a new kind of enterprise logic that is global in scope if it wants to be, that is speaking to the new society of individuals, which, as we have seen, is already a global phenomenon. So I call this new entity a federated support network. Why federated? It's not just a random idea. Look, in the late 19th century, before the big corporation, this big concentrated thing came along, how did companies coordinate among themselves? They formed what were called federations. Largely, they were geographically in proximity because they didn't have an internet. And they all did, different pieces of a value chain. And they were a federation. Well, we only formed these big concentrations, these big vertically integrated agglomerations. We only formed those as a coordination mechanism. You probably know that if if anybody went to business school, you know that. This was a coordination mechanism. Managerial capitalism was named after the coordination mechanism for this business model. Okay? We don't need that coordination mechanism anymore. It was the solution. Oh, I've got 1 minute. Okay. But then I've got the 5 minutes that you stand up over there. So, okay. I promise it won't take more than 6 minutes. We've got the coordination mechanisms now that if we had had them in the year 1913, we wouldn't have formed these great big concentrated behemoths, right? We would have remained federated. Because federated means that, my point is that what was the solution to the problem in the year 1910, 1913, 1920, 1945, what was the solution to the problem has now become the problem. So when we move out of the concentrated mode, we can go back to federation. Now, if we're really honest about saying we're clustering assets around the individual, guess what? Individual lives don't come organized by industrial categories, economic sectors, what's public, what's private, what's in Bangalore, or what's in my backyard. Individual lives come organized like, oh my God, the babysitter hasn't come and I have to get to work. I'm in Detroit on a business trip. No, I won't say Detroit. Nobody goes to Detroit. I'm in San Francisco on a business trip, and my washing machine broke. I need to find a summer camp, and tonight my mother-in-law had a heart attack, God forbid, and I need to find a cardiologist. This is how human life is organized. And so when we're going to organize our assets around the individual, the first thing we want to say is, who are you? What kind of support do you need? How can we help? And by the way, whom do we need to collaborate with so that we can give you the support you need to live your life the way you want to live it? So we're no longer talking about all these boundaries that have been the sine qua non of 20th century business. So these are kind of the big categories that cluster around individuals. And what you can imagine now, are federated support networks as branded constellations of enterprises, united in a shared commitment to provide particular qualities of support to their communities of constituents whose unmet needs are now holding the key to realizing unmet economic value. And we can imagine individuals opting in to different networks that meet their needs. And you may opt into many, many different networks. And there may be networks that appeal to different life cycle. And there may be networks that appeal to all sorts of different groupings of constituents. In our book, we fantasized about what we call the Golden Apple Network, which was a network that carried forward Apple's brand values, but now into a federated network around individuals. So, if Apple had read my book, they'd realize that the iPod is only the tiny, tiny, tiny tip of the iceberg. It's just the first little thread to breaking into this economic value. So ultimately, when we're talking about the creative response that is needed to fully jumpstart the next cycle of accumulation and move into the uncolonized white space and reconnect with today's unmet needs, we're talking about asset migration. We're not talking about spending the next umpteen years trying to change business as usual. We're going to look for those institutional bypasses. We're going to send out the lifeboats. We're going to migrate the assets. We are going to reconnect. And when we do this, the new system draws profits to itself. It draws cash out of people like a magnet draws iron filings. And it draws more assets out of the old models where it's currently trapped, like a magnet draws iron filings. Let me tell you, to close, let me tell you how Schumpeter described the creative response, because there's a piece here that I love. He says, the doing of new or old things in a new way doesn't draw a sharp line between what is or isn't enterprise, because life does not draw those distinctions. It need not be spectacular or of historic importance. It need not be Bessemer steel or the combustion motor. It can be the Deerfoot Sausage Company. To see the phenomenon, even in the humblest levels of the business world, is quite essential. And that's why I say to you today, we can see pieces of the puzzle in so many humble examples. And my belief, my reading of history, my reading of this moment in history is that while it is not predetermined, we face an unusual historical opportunity right now to see these pieces brought together in a new kind of constellation, in a new enterprise logic, to reconnect with the needs of our times and create those activities uniquely suited to create wealth in our episode of capitalism. Okay, thank you very much.